Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Story number 1. No Higher Honor, written by Provisional Rebel. The damned Rashan's allies were a great concern to the Grand Elder, but one that was finally to be brought to heel. He scratched the scar across his right eye absently. This was a strategic move, of course, but he would take a small joy in the retribution. The guilds had discovered a vital port that they were seen returning to following battle, and it was time to strike them down. His ship approach was unobstructed, and the space station seemed pitiful. Where were their defensive screens? Where was their patrol craft? He balked at such weakness and ordered his warriors to ready the boarding craft as he evaluated their target from the sensor imaging. There were several options, but one room held his interest. Its bulkheads along the exterior wall were viable for boarding, and it seemed like a massive area with many life forms. The battle would be joined in this chamber. He met his command squad in their craft after delivering the orders to his pilots. He would be the first into battle, the first to draw blood. The doors closed, and he felt a lurch as they launched towards the seemingly unaware prey. A loud clang filled the air as the magnetic clamps made contact, and metallic tingle touched his nostrils as the plasma cutters began their work. The screams seemed to begin before the torches had even melted through properly. He could hear the anguished cries vibrating through the bulkhead, and it brought him much satisfaction. Vengeance for the Atreus campaign, brothers! No prisoners! No prisoners! These men cried out in discordant answer. Then, in a flash, the ramp was down, and the battle was joined. Although quickly he felt cheated. These were certainly the enemy that he'd fought before, but they were wrong. Far too weak. Many struggled to even rise from their beds before his warriors began to cut them down. Where was the order of the White Hats? His thought was quickly put aside as a laser burned a hole into his armored shoulder before he could dive for cover. He called for his men to return fire, and it was a simple thing. The enemy was apparently unarmored and seemed to only be armed with a sidearm. His chest burst with the first detonation. He scanned over the room, absently firing as targets began to flee. There was seemingly 100 beds, all surrounded with complex machinery of some kind. He pondered this strange place for a moment, but remembered himself. Bloodlust was not his place here. He was to command, not to give in to savagery. He began to give orders to his men as the large chamber emptied of living prey. Some escaped into the passageways, but many had died screaming in their beds. Though it was not long until he had exactly the fight that he'd been expecting, if not from the same warriors he wanted. His men began to meet more resistance as they strayed from the chamber. At first, there was merely more of the unarmored fodder with sidearms, but soon they were joined with armored warriors wielding heavier armaments. His casualties began to mount quickly, but it appeared that the enemy lost their reserves almost immediately, if they had any to begin with. It was disappointing. This was a massacre more than a bold raid on an enemy stronghold, held by only a token force of true warriors as he had faced before. One by one, the warriors were felled. His men then began to sweep over the rest of the station, reaping their bounty from the defenseless drones. As soon as he had a moment, he inspected a handful of armored corpses. It was splashed with viscera, where their powerful armor had finally collapsed under the weight of fire, obscuring the glaring red insignias that they seemed to share amongst each other. Crossed lines, slim curves, among others on white shoulder plates. These must be other orders, like the White Hats that he had faced before. Their warrior caste must truly be a rare breed for so few to be among so many, he mused. He allowed himself a moment to chuckle. more sure of even the losses that he had suffered. After all, an enemy so dependent on those rare few strong enough to fight would suffer greatly for each loss. His eye slowly traveled across the room. He would remember this place, surely. It was to be a great victory, if perhaps less than honorable. Still, there was no higher honor than victory. Perhaps he would even drive these French from the wall. His eyes finally rested on a large insignia adorning the wall, inscribed with the aliens' ruins. UNSC, Mercy Station. End of story. Part 2. No Greater Shame, written by Provisional Rebel. The pain was blinding, but he knew it would be brief. His body was broken, and every breath grew weaker and weaker. Still, he was conscious. He had time to contemplate another mark of shame to be added to his clan's name. Not that any were likely to survive the engagement. It was him and his men, after all. They were responsible for every ill that had befallen his people since they raided the human station. That was one of the first things they had found out after the battle as they pilfered the data calls for information. It hadn't even been their enemy. Their first shame. He had attacked a neutral clan without the orders or permission of the council. And this clan was, to be put bluntly, simply dangerous. They had come under fire before they had even pulled away from the station. He lost 2 frigates and the hellish guns of the enemy's fighters. They fought them off, but they hadn't managed to destroy them. And so another wave would soon come. They were relentless, their escape harrowed by enemies who seemed to materialize from all directions. His withdrawal had turned into a blind panic as he ordered all of his vessels to split up and flee to friendly systems. The second shame, but one that he could have borne if it succeeded. That then was the third and final shame that saw him stripped of his place as a Grand Elder, the shame that broke his spirit and robbed him of his honors. His ship was the only one that had escaped. He was a coward, and braver warriors than he had died because of his panic. But it was useless to deal with speculations of what could have been now. At least his prior position had afforded him a chance at redemption. A lesser warrior would have been executed as a criminal, but he had found himself back on the front line, bound by an oath to fight and die. And so he fought for 2 solar cycles for his soul's redemption, and his people's empire crumbled to dust around him. His thoughts were broken by the sound of heavy footsteps. He couldn't muster the strength to move his head, but soon he saw the death that approached him. A human warrior bearing a white pauldron with a red crescent. He had to admit the poetic justice of the situation. He had slaughtered them when they were helpless, and so was what would befall him. The world began to dim in his vision as he waited for the killing blow. But then he was forced into a silent scream as his executioner began to manipulate his body. The pain was beyond excruciating, and soon the world went dark. He awoke, but fire crawled through his nerves. This was not the hall the ancestors had envisioned. Perhaps even his oath was not enough to redeem him in the eyes of the gods. But no, his vision began to clear, and he was oriented slowly to his surroundings. He tried to wipe his eyes, but realized his hand was gone. He gaped in horror before tugging at something on his other arm. His eyes fell on the metal chain that was connected to the bed. Heavy straps held him tight across the chest and legs, at least what remained of his legs. They had taken him alive. There was no greater shame, an unforgivable shame. He was not worthy of even death. With a sinking dread, he began to wonder at the prospect that they would keep him alive in humiliation for his treacherous attack. He was surrounded by a cloth hung across a rail. It seemed familiar to him, but suddenly it was pulled aside, and the human stepped into his cell. It took a note of several machines around him after an appraising glance at its prisoner. Seemingly satisfied that he was alert, he looked away to hide the tears and saw the guards pass the curtain that was left open. Most were unarmored, but again were the white pauldrons, rifles in hands. Over the past 2 cycles, he learned that they were rare, even amongst their warriors, perhaps 1 in 30. But this place was guarded almost exclusively by them. Perhaps they had taken him prisoner as a trophy, or a sacrifice for the fallen of the initial attack. It was then that his eyes finally rested on a large insignia adorning the far wall, inscribed with the sickeningly familiar alien runes etched into the recess of his memory. UNSC, Mercy Station. End of story. I just want to quickly thank the T5 channel members and patrons: Alithia, Barky, Trygan95, Beauty Cure, Meridian 117, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholt, Jordan Bucksborn, Angry Marine, Albard and Gusta, Savage Patch Papa, and Arcadian. The algorithm reckons you should be watching this video next, and I recommend that you should be always watching my video. So, click with energy! And yes, clicking that does help the channel. Thank you very much.